when a black Air Force veteran closes his own garage in a quiet suburb. A nosy HOA board member calls 911, unleashing a chain of events she never expected. What he uncovers about the neighborhood's dark secrets will shake the community to its core. Marcus Reynolds had just moved into the upscale Willow Creek Estates a few weeks ago, finally realizing a dream that had taken years of discipline, sacrifice, and ambition. A tall, composed man in his late 30s, Marcus was the embodiment of quiet resilience, an Air Force veteran turned real estate investor who had worked his way up from humble beginnings. After years of grinding, saving, and finessing deals, he was finally able to buy a spacious home in a community that prided itself on order, tradition, and standards. He had chosen Willow Creek for its tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a sense of calm that his previous neighborhood lacked. At least, that's what he hoped for. The gated suburb was picturesque, but it didn't take long for Marcus to realize that behind the brick facades and perfectly trimmed hedges, some neighbors were far more concerned with conformity and control than community. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, Marcus was organizing his garage, enjoying the cool air and the distant sound of birds. He had pulled his car halfway in and was unloading boxes with a calm efficiency, setting up the workbench he planned to use for weekend projects. A smooth jazz playlist hummed softly from his car speakers, not loud enough to disturb anyone, just enough to fill the space with rhythm. He was in his element, surrounded by tools and dreams of DIY renovations. As he stepped back to admire his progress and wiped sweat from his brow, he reached up and hit the remote to close the garage door. That's when he noticed her, standing across the street, arms folded, mouth pursed, a woman he hadn't seen before. She wore a stiff floral blouse, beige capris, and a look that seemed permanently disapproving. Her name, he would later learn, was Karen Whitmore, longtime resident and one of the most vocal members of the HOA board. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. Instead, as Marcus turned back toward his house, she reached in her handbag, pulled out her phone, and took a few cautious steps back toward her porch. Within seconds, she was dialing. 911. What's your emergency? Came the calm voice of the dispatcher. There's a man, Karen whispered urgently. A suspicious man in someone's garage across the street. I don't think he lives there. He looks like he's trying to break in. Marcus had no idea a call had been made. Inside, he grabbed a bottle of water and returned to the garage, which he opened again to bring in a shelving unit from the side of the driveway. He was mid-lift when two police cruisers rolled slowly onto the street. No sirens, just flashing lights and the cold tension of unwanted attention. Marcus set the shelf down and instinctively raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but as a nonverbal signal. I'm not a threat. The officers stepped out cautiously. Sir, may we ask if you live here? One asked, hand near his belt, but not on his weapon. Marcus blinked, confused. Yes, this is my house. What's going on? We got a call reporting a possible break-in. A break-in? Marcus scoffed. This is my garage. I literally just moved in last month. Do you have any identification or proof of residence? Of course. Marcus went back inside briefly, returning with his driver's license and a folder containing mortgage documents. He handed them over calmly, watching the officers flip through them. The younger of the two gave a small nod of recognition. Looks like everything checks out. Sorry about the disturbance, Mr. Reynolds. That's when Karen stepped out, still on her porch, and called out, I told you, he doesn't belong here. I've never seen him before. One officer turned to her. Ma'am, we've confirmed he lives here. Everything's fine. He's been in that garage all day. No one told us someone new moved in. That's not grounds to call 911. The officer snapped, more irritated now. This line is for emergencies. Misusing it can carry consequences. Karen, flustered but unrepentant, turned and stormed back into her home. Marcus stood there in stunned silence. The officers offered a half-hearted apology before driving away, leaving behind an invisible but heavy cloud of suspicion and discomfort. As the police cars rolled away, Marcus saw curtains shift. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds. A few people stepped outside to walk their dogs or check the mail. One neighbor, an older man across the street, gave Marcus a sheepish wave. Another nodded and said, "Sorry about that, man. Some folks just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Karen wasn't finished either. Later that evening, Marcus received an email from the HOA citing an incident and asking for him to appear at the next community meeting to address a potential violation. The email mentioned unauthorized activity in his garage and failure to announce residency formally. Marcus read it 3 times. He had followed every rule. He'd filed all his documents. His mailbox had the right colonial white paint. His recycling bin was stored precisely where the handbook required. But apparently, that wasn't enough. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the glow from his laptop reflecting off a cup of untouched tea. He opened the HOA bylaws and began reading, slowly, methodically. He bookmarked every clause that mentioned garage usage, guest policies, and resident verification. Some sections were vague. Others felt oddly specific. One rule stated that garage doors must not remain open for more than 30 minutes. Marcus remembered checking his watch. He had been well within that window. Another section mentioned HOA discretion in determining neighborhood safety. That word, discretion, stuck with him. It was a word people like Karen used as a veil for something uglier. He clicked over to the HOA's public website, curious about the board. Karen Whitmore had been on the board for 7 years. There were 2 other longtime members, both retirees who had lived in Willow Creek for over a decade. All HOA board members had access to residency records, which meant Karen knew exactly who he was. She had to have seen the notice of sale. She had likely received the new resident packet. Her actions weren't ignorance. They were something else entirely. And Marcus, who had built his career on reading between the lines, could feel that something didn't add up. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not because of pride, but because he had a gut feeling, the kind that whispers, "This isn't just about you." He had friends who lived in communities like this. He had heard stories of similar mistakes. But now that it was happening to him, Marcus realized this wasn't isolated. It was part of something bigger, and if Karen thought she could weaponize fear and authority to gatekeep this neighborhood, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The morning after the 911 call, Marcus woke up with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Not just the weight of what happened, but the realization that what had seemed like a single incident might just be the tip of something deeper. He sipped his coffee and stared at the neighborhood from his front porch. The street was still and quiet, deceptively serene. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and children waited at the bus stop. But beneath the surface, Marcus felt the tremors of something ugly, something masked behind trimmed hedges and welcome mats. He wasn't going to let it slide. That wasn't his nature. Not when it came to principle. He started by rereading the HOA handbook, this time with a legal pad at his side. He highlighted inconsistencies and underlined vague phrases. Words like community integrity and preserving neighborhood culture leapt off the page. They were coded, and Marcus knew all too well what they were really saying. He had seen similar language in zoning meetings, in old housing covenants, in policy decisions that always claimed to be neutral but never were. Then he moved to the HOA website and pulled up minutes from past meetings. Some were bare bones, just notes on landscaping budgets and pool repairs. But others were full of passive-aggressive complaints. One entry from 6 months ago noted concerns about increased rental properties attracting unfamiliar guests. Another log concern from residents about unknown individuals walking dogs without leashes. It didn't name names, but it didn't need to. The subtext was clear. Karen and her board weren't just micromanaging. They were gatekeeping. And Marcus was beginning to suspect they'd been doing it for a long time. What really caught his eye was a section in one set of notes marked executive discussion. This part wasn't public, but it was referenced in vague terms. Board will continue vetting incoming residents using discretion afforded by Section 4C. Marcus flipped back to his handbook. Section 4C granted the board discretion to maintain the character of the neighborhood through non-public processes. That language wasn't just suspicious, it was dangerous. By day 3, Marcus had created a spreadsheet of all recent HOA complaints, resident move-ins, and fines issued, all public via local records and county property filings. What he found stunned him. Over the past 2 years, 6 families of color had moved into Willow Creek Estates. 4 of them had received HOA violations within 60 days of moving in. 2 had moved out less than a year later, citing neighborhood tensions in the open comment sections of their listings when they resold their homes. In contrast, newer white residents had almost no infractions in their first year. The pattern wasn't just clear, it was calculated. Marcus also found a post on a community Facebook group, one he hadn't been added to, where a neighbor had once asked about security concerns with changing neighborhood demographics. The post was deleted, but not before someone had screenshotted it. That someone happened to be a young woman named Tasha, who lived a few streets over and had been quietly keeping her own notes. Marcus reached out. They met at a small cafe just outside the neighborhood, a neutral place where eyes wouldn't follow them. Tasha, a teacher in her late 20s, wore a hoodie and glasses, looking down at her latte like she was unsure how much to say. "I moved here about 18 months ago," she explained. "Karen told me, straight up, that she hoped I'd fit in. And when I asked what that meant, she said, 'Oh, keeping the place looking respectable.' I didn't think much of it at first, but then I got a citation for leaving my trash bin out past 10 a.m. on pickup day. Meanwhile, my white neighbor left us out until sunset. No problem." Marcus nodded. Same script, different cast. Tasha showed him a folder of emails and notices she'd saved. Official-looking letters from the HOA citing violations that were flimsy at best. Grass an inch too long. A planter that was supposedly not in alignment with neighborhood aesthetic. They were the kind of complaints that could be justified on paper, but were always selectively enforced. And then she handed Marcus the real goldmine, a photo she had snapped of a bulletin board at the clubhouse. It had since been taken down, but when it was still up, it displayed a chart Karen had pinned, unofficial but telling. It was titled Community Consistency Goals and listed vague metrics like visual cohesion, noise uniformity, and guest accountability. Next to it was a handwritten note, "Board to revisit guidelines for screening and enforcement." "This is systemic," Marcus muttered. "It's why I've been looking for someone else to talk to about it," Tasha said. "I just didn't know who would take it seriously." Marcus did, and now he was building a case. He started documenting everything, every interaction, every email, every ambiguous comment. He bought a doorbell camera, not just for security, but to make sure any future complaints were backed by actual footage. He scanned HOA emails for language shifts, looking for coordinated patterns in how they addressed him versus other neighbors. Every time Karen sent a note, it was overly formal, cold, and filled with veiled implications. Then came the anonymous letter, slipped into his mailbox without a stamp or envelope. The folded paper was typed. No signature, just this message. "You're not the first, but you might be the last. Watch your back. Some people play dirty." Marcus stared at the note for a long time. There was no return address, no hint at who had sent it. But someone was watching. Someone who either supported him or wanted to warn him off. He wasn't sure which yet. He filed the letter, photographed it, and added it to his timeline of events. And then, just days before the next HOA board meeting, he made a call to an old friend, Alicia, a civil rights attorney he'd served with during his Air Force days. She listened to his rundown, let out a slow whistle, and said, "This might be even bigger than an HOA problem. This could qualify as a Fair Housing Act violation if you can prove racial targeting." "I don't just want to prove it," Marcus said. "I want to expose it. Publicly." Alicia agreed to help. They started prepping a formal complaint, not to the HOA, but to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They gathered every piece of documentation, organized by date, with supporting evidence and testimonial. Tasha agreed to write a statement. 2 other residents, also people of color, offered to do the same once Marcus approached them discreetly. A pattern was emerging, one that went beyond Marcus's own experience. At the same time, Marcus prepared a presentation for the upcoming HOA meeting. He planned to confront Karen and the board directly, but he wasn't going in unarmed. He had the bylaws, the pattern of citations, the demographic data, and the timeline of harassment. And more importantly, he had people watching now. Neighbors who had once looked through blinds were beginning to look at each other and ask questions. Because Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was about to crack something open that Karen never saw coming. The community room at the Willow Creek Clubhouse had never been this packed. Every folding chair was filled. Neighbors lined the back wall. A few stood awkwardly by the refreshments table, holding paper cups of lukewarm lemonade. The usual HOA meetings attracted maybe 10 people. Tonight, nearly 50 residents showed up, murmuring among themselves. A strange energy filled the air, anticipation, curiosity, maybe even tension. At the center of it all sat Karen Whitmore, still poised in her seat at the front table, her back stiff, clipboard in hand, as if she knew what was coming but hoped to ride it out with forced authority. Marcus stood in the second row, waiting for his moment. The president called the meeting to order with a gavel tap and an obligatory greeting. He glanced at the agenda, running through landscaping updates and minor policy shifts, all the typical HOA filler. Then, finally, the president cleared his throat. "We've had a resident request time to address the board and the community regarding recent concerns," he said. "Mr. Reynolds, you have the floor." Marcus stepped forward with a calmness that quieted the room. He held a manila folder in one hand, a small tablet in the other, and looked out across the rows of neighbors. Some familiar, others watching cautiously. "Thank you," he began. "I want to talk about something uncomfortable. Something most of us would rather pretend doesn't happen here, but it does. And I have proof." He briefly recapped the 911 call that had started everything, presenting it factually but without softening the racial implication. Then he played the recording from his doorbell cam. The moment police showed up, his interaction with them, and Karen's voice shouting from her porch. The audio filled the room like a slap to the face. Some gasped. Others exchanged looks. Karen shifted in her seat, lips tightening. Marcus continued. "This wasn't an isolated incident. Since moving here, I've experienced targeted behavior disguised as enforcement. But it turns out I'm not alone." He flipped open the folder and began laying out charts. Violations issued to new residents, broken down by race and frequency. A summary of HOA citations and complaint patterns. A timeline of suspicious incidents. Then he held up the photo of the bulletin board, the one with the community consistency goals and vague enforcement language. "This isn't about garbage bins or lawn heights," Marcus said, voice steady. "This is about selective enforcement. It's about exclusion hidden under the cover of policy. And it's illegal." Karen interjected, her voice shrill and shaking slightly. "This is completely out of line. You don't understand the responsibilities of the HOA. We have rules for a reason." "I understand rules," Marcus said. "I also understand weaponized discretion. I serve this country to protect rights, not to move into a gated suburb and be told I don't belong." He turned to the projector and displayed an email from the HOA president, who had once copied Karen on a message that included the phrase, "We'll need to keep an eye on that one." The date matched Marcus's first week in the neighborhood. Several residents audibly gasped. One of them, an older white woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, stood up and said, "I remember when the Jacksons moved in. They were fined for wind chimes." Wind chimes. She shook her head, and I never saw Karen speak to them once. The tide began to shift. Tasha, who had quietly slipped in and taken a seat at the back, raised her hand and introduced herself. "I've lived here for a year and a half. I've been cited for flower colors, fence style, and having a guest park in the wrong direction." Meanwhile, the house next door threw a late-night 4th of July party with fireworks, and no one said a word. Guess what the difference was? The room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus closed with the big reveal. "I filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Multiple residents have submitted statements. We are investigating whether Willow Creek Estates has violated the Fair Housing Act. Discrimination in housing is a federal crime. Whether it's through lending, renting, or HOA enforcement, it's illegal." He turned to Karen directly. "You may think this is your neighborhood to control, but it's our neighborhood now, and we're done being quiet." Karen tried to speak again, but her voice caught in her throat. She fumbled with her clipboard, then looked to the president of the board, who had suddenly gone pale. "We should move this into executive session," he said. Marcus shook his head. "No, let's keep it public. We all deserve to hear it." After the meeting, the clubhouse was buzzing. Neighbors clustered in groups, some expressing shock, others apologizing to Marcus, a few still skeptical but quiet. Marcus didn't gloat. He just stood outside, talking to Tasha and the others, letting the momentum carry itself. He knew this wasn't over, but something had broken loose. In the following weeks, the impact was unmistakable. Karen resigned from the HOA board due to health concerns, though word got around that she had been pressured to step down by other members fearing legal exposure. An interim board was appointed, with residents pushing for reform. Marcus was nominated to fill one of the vacancies, not because he asked, but because people finally saw him for who he was, a leader. HUD acknowledged receipt of the complaint and began their formal inquiry. Several neighbors came forward to share their experiences, including a Latino couple who had been cited for parking aesthetics and a retired black veteran who had been fined for painting his shutters the exact shade approved in the handbook. The story began to ripple outside the gates. A local reporter got wind of the situation and published a piece titled "Discrimination Behind the Gates: The Willow Creek Reckoning." It went viral in the region. Marcus found himself in unfamiliar territory. Local news interviews, community forums, even invited to speak at a city council meeting on HOA abuse and racial bias in suburban governance. He didn't do it for attention. He did it to create awareness, to prevent the next person from walking into the same trap thinking they'd found peace, only to be policed by the very people who were supposed to protect the community. And one afternoon, weeks later, Marcus stood in front of his garage again. This time, he was hanging a sign, custom-made. It read, "This home belongs. So does yours." Karen drove by slowly in her beige SUV. For once, she didn't stop. She didn't glare. She didn't roll down her window. She just drove on, past a neighborhood that was no longer hers to control. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and change had a name. Marcus Reynolds.